Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
Good morning, I'm Nathan Hager.
And I'm Karen Moscow. Here are the stories we're following today.
Karen, we begin with the latest developments to end the war in Ukraine. Top U.S. and European diplomats are gathering in Turkey, but hopes are fading for any major breakthrough. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is due to meet with Turkey's leader Recep Tayyip Erdogan, but Russian President Vladimir Putin will not. Here's NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte.
Russia is sending only a lower-level delegation now to Turkey, to these peace talks. It is the Ukrainians who have said we are ready to sit down with the Russians, to agree a ceasefire, to immediately go into negotiations about the next steps to bring this terrible war to an end.
That was NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, and in remarks heard live on Bloomberg Radio, President Trump said he will also not attend. He talked about it in Doha this morning.
I was thinking about going, but it's very tough because of what we're doing today and tomorrow. But, if something happened, I'd go on Friday if it was appropriate. But we have people right now negotiating.
President Trump also says the U.S. is close to reaching a nuclear deal with Iran.
And you probably read today the story about Iran has sort of agreed to the terms. They're not going to make, I call it in a friendly way, nuclear dust. We're not going to be making any nuclear dust in Iran.
The president referring there to an NBC News report that Iran would be willing to commit not to have nuclear weapons in exchange for sanctions relief. President Trump says he does not want to have to take a violent step if negotiations don't work.
And Karen, the president also touched on trade negotiations with India. He says that country's made a dramatic offer.
India is one of the highest tariff nations in the world. It's very hard to sell into India. And they've offered us a deal where basically they're willing to literally charge us no tariff.
President Trump also said he told Apple CEO Tim Cook not to build in India, that Apple's agreed to expand production in the U.S. Apple had been shifting manufacturing to India from China to supply the U.S. market.
Nathan, U.S. and Chinese officials met for trade talks in South Korea just days after both sides met in Switzerland and agreed to pause some tariffs for 90 days. Here's Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent.
We're going to go into a series of negotiations. They're going to be fulsome, and we have a lot to talk about. But I think over the next 90 days, we can accomplish a lot.
Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent speaking earlier this morning in Doha. Bloomberg News has learned Trade Representative Jamieson Greer met with China's chief trade representative in South Korea this morning.
Let's turn to markets now, Karen, and some company news. Word this morning that UnitedHealth is facing a criminal probe. Let's get the very latest from Bloomberg's John Tucker. Good morning, John.
Good morning, Nathan. The Wall Street Journal reports the Justice Department investigating UnitedHealth Group for possible criminal Medicare fraud. The paper, citing sources, is saying this has been an active probe since at least last summer. You'll recall that earlier this week, the CEO, Andrew Whitty, was suddenly replaced. It adds to a long list of problems. The company is facing investigations of potential antitrust violations and a civil investigation of its Medicare billing. What's more, the Trump administration looking to cut federal health spending, and that is a key source of UnitedHealth's success. And of course, nobody can forget one of its executives was gunned down in Manhattan, leading to an online surge of support for the alleged shooter. The company is the worst performer in the Dow so far this year, down 39%. And in pre-market trading right now, the shares, they are down close to 5%. In New York, I'm John Tucker, Bloomberg Radio.
All right, John, thank you. Well, retail also in the spotlight this morning. Bloomberg News has learned Dick's Sporting Goods is in advanced talks to buy Foot Locker for $24 a share. The acquisition would bring together two companies with different business models, with Foot Locker operating 2,400 smaller stores globally and Dick's operating 800 big box stores in U.S. suburbs. And shares of Foot Locker surging this morning, up 69%.
And we'll get earnings, Karen, from a retail giant, Walmart, this morning. We get a preview now from Bloomberg's Tom Busby.
The key for investors is whether customer spending has changed amid the uncertainty around the Trump tariffs and whether that uncertainty has brought the retailer any new customers looking for lower-priced goods. Of note, Walmart makes about half its revenue from groceries, which are largely immune to those levies. Same-store sales in the U.S. expected to be nearly 4% higher. Comp sales at its Sam's Club warehouse stores should be up nearly 5%. Bloomberg consensus calls for revenue of $166.02 billion on adjusted earnings of 58 cents a share. Tom Busby, Bloomberg Radio.
Tom, thank you. The Walmart earnings are due out at 7 a.m. Wall Street time. Then 90 minutes later, we'll get the April reading on retail sales. Economists are looking for sales to be unchanged. And Bloomberg's Michael McKee has a preview.
It's one of the few data points with relevance in this waiting on Trump's tariffs period. Sentiment surveys have shown an increasingly depressed consumer. For the Fed and retail investors, the question is whether attitude translates to action. The consensus forecast suggests not yet. Car sales pulled forward earlier this year by tariff threats likely slowed, but clothing and other consumer goods likely rose as consumers look to front-run Trump's import taxes. So this report will get noticed. Michael McKee, Bloomberg Radio.
All right, Mike, thanks. And investors are also going to be looking for clues on the future of interest rates. Fed Chair Jay Powell speaks about the economy at a conference before this morning's opening bell.
Nathan, billionaire Steve Cohen says the chance of a recession in the U.S. now stands at about 45%. The founder of hedge fund Point72 Asset Management says he does not expect the Fed to cut rates right away because, quote, they are going to be worried about inflation from tariffs. Cohen made the comments at the Sohn Investment Conference in New York yesterday. Time now for a look at some of the other stories making news in New York and around the world. And for that, we're joined by Bloomberg's Michael Barr. Michael, good morning.
Good morning, Karen. More testimony from Cassie Ventura, the ex-girlfriend of Sean Diddy Combs, in the federal government sex trafficking and racketeering case against the music mogul. Ventura says Combs forced her to record encounters with multiple male escorts and using the humiliating footage as leverage. Ventura testified she was trying to escape a sex encounter at a Los Angeles hotel in 2016 when Combs was caught on security cameras running down the hall, knocking her down and kicking her. Ventura will testify for a third day this morning. Governor Kathy Hochul announced that inflation refund checks up to $400 will be sent this fall to 8.2 million households across New York State. Hochul says she's fighting to help families address the rising cost of living.
And groceries, you just look at it every single week and think, the prices are going up, and my paycheck is not.
Opponents wanted a more robust rainy day fund for the state. Two New York Republicans, Nicole Malliotakis and Nick LaLota, signaled that the cap on the state and local tax deduction may rise to as much as $80,000. GOP lawmakers from high-tax states demand a boost in exchange for their votes on President Trump's tax package. The bill sets the cap at $30,000 right now. LaLota on Bloomberg's Balance of Power says, though, that's not enough.
We got to go back home and sell this at a low $30K cap when unlimited would come at the end of the year if this bill expires wouldn't be sufficient for my constituents.
The current $10,000 SALT cap expires at the end of the year. The U.S. approved the sale of $304 million worth of missiles to Turkey as the NATO allies work to strengthen trade and defense ties. The EPA said that it plans to weaken limits on some forever chemicals in drinking water that were finalized last year. Emily Donovan is the co-founder of Clean Cape Fear.
They're called PFAS, PFAS, and polyfluoroalkyl substances, but we also refer to them as forever chemicals because they tend to live forever and there's no proven safe disposal method.
The Biden administration set the first federal drinking water limits for PFAS, finding they increase the risk of certain cancers. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Michael Barr, and this is Bloomberg, Karen.
All right, Michael Barr, thank you. Time now for the Bloomberg Sports Update. Here's John Stashower. John, good morning.
Good morning, Karen. Knicks fans have been waiting 25 years to see their team play in the conference finals. They have to wait at least a couple more days. The Knicks finally lost a road playoff game. They'd been 5-0. The Celtics stayed alive, 127-102. A combined 60 points by Derek White and Jaylen Brown, and backup center Luke Cornett, given extra playing time due to the Jason Tatum injury, had 10 points, 9 rebounds, and 7 blocked shots. In defeat, Josh Hart had his best game, led the Knicks with 24 4. It's now 3-2 Knicks going back to the Garden for Game 6 tomorrow. Minnesota going back to the West Finals, beat Golden State for a fourth straight time, 121-110. Last year's Stanley Cup final was Florida against Edmonton. Both won on the road. The Panthers 6-1 in Toronto, go up 3-2 in the series. The Oilers in Vegas, the game was scoreless for 67 minutes.
Podkolzin finds Draisaitl, sets up Nurse, shoots, save made by Hill. He does a snow 18 in the blue paint. It's on the goal line, score! It's over. The series is over. The Edmonton Oilers win it in overtime.
ESPN, Edmonton wins the series 4-1. The Yankee road trip ended with a 3-2 win in Seattle thanks to an Aaron Judge 8th inning home run, his 15th, and Judge goes to the start of the Subway Series tomorrow with a .412 batting average. The Mets go in off a 4-0 home loss to Pittsburgh. The Nationals ended their 7-game losing streak, 5-4 in Atlanta. The Red Sox lost in the 9th inning in Detroit, 6-5. The Tigers have the best record in baseball. The Giants learned their season will not begin easily in Washington, in Dallas. Then the home opener, a Sunday night game with Kansas City. The Jets open at home with Pittsburgh, so they could very well be facing Aaron Rodgers. The 107th PGA Championship tees off today in Charlotte. For our listeners in New York, Boston, and D.C., live coverage after the closing bell and all weekend long on Bloomberg Radio. John Stanshauer, Bloomberg Sports. Karen and Nathan.
Coast to coast on Bloomberg Radio, nationwide on Sirius XM, and around the world on Bloomberg.com and the Bloomberg Business app. This is Bloomberg Daybreak.
Good morning. I'm Nathan Hager on a morning where prospects for a breakthrough between Russia and Ukraine in their more than 3-year war may be fading. Foreign ministers are meeting in Turkey for those talks, but Russian President Vladimir Putin is sending only a low-level delegation. President Trump, for his part, is sounding hopeful on that and other tension points.
Would like to see it end, and I think we're going to have a chance at doing it, and would like to see if we could solve the Iran problem in an intelligent way as opposed to a brutal way. There's only two, intelligent and brutal. Those are the two alternatives.
That was President Trump speaking at a meeting of business leaders in Qatar, heard live on Bloomberg Radio. This morning, we're joined by Rosalind Matheson, Bloomberg News Director for Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. Roz, thanks for being with us. What are the chances for a breakthrough in Turkey when we don't have President Putin apparently coming to meet with President Zelensky? Good morning.
Good morning. Yes, well, there are parallel meetings that could be going on in Turkey. I mean, today we do have the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. He's going to be meeting with the Turkish President Erdogan. Separate to that, there was the expectation of this meeting between Russian and Ukrainian officials, and we know that Russia is sending only what you'd have to describe as a fairly low-level delegation, to attend these talks. A former negotiator who was involved back in 2022, but not even the foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, in town for that so far, it seems. And so what are those talks possibly going to achieve without a higher level of representation? Certainly the Russian officials there can't sign off on any kind of parameters around a ceasefire. There's a lot of pressure, obviously, from the US and elsewhere on Russia to agree to at least a 30-day ceasefire. Maybe the conversation today sets us on the path towards that, but without the Russian president there in person, because really all of the decisions about where Russia goes in this war with Ukraine are made by Vladimir Putin himself. If he's not there to lead those conversations, then it's unclear what kind of progress we're going to get. And we're getting indications this morning from the Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov, who gave what had to be described as a negative response when he was asked about whether there was a chance that Putin might still show up in Turkey today or tomorrow. So it doesn't seem at this stage like that's on the table. But of course, the US President Donald Trump has dangled the possibility that he could duck over to Turkey at some point, possibly tomorrow, if Vladimir Putin were to change his mind.
The impression that President Trump seemed to give in some of his comments was that Putin might not be coming to Turkey because President Trump might not be able to fit that visit of his own on his schedule. Is that the impression that European leaders seem to share from the conversations that are coming out of Turkey now?
Well, Donald Trump does have a busy schedule, and he's been in the Middle East for several days, and there's been a blizzard of deals and meetings involved in that, and obviously he's due to return. But, you know, this is one of the biggest things on Donald Trump's to-do list, his priority list, is to get a ceasefire in Ukraine. And no doubt, if the Russian president said he was going to turn up in Turkey, that Donald Trump would divert his plane and turn up in Turkey, possibly tomorrow, or maybe even come back to Turkey on the weekend. I mean, for Donald Trump, this is a really important thing. But the question is, does Vladimir Putin want to do that, especially when the Ukrainian president is in town? Because you can imagine the preferred choreography for Vladimir Putin is for him to first meet one-on-one with Donald Trump and to have that conversation and those meetings directly and not have Zelensky in the room. And then perhaps at some point it becomes a three-way conversation. But you'd imagine that Vladimir Putin would see himself as first wanting to knit things off with Donald Trump. And that makes, again, the possibility of a meeting today or tomorrow less likely.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak, your morning podcast on the stories making news from Wall Street to Washington and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed by 6 a.m. Eastern each morning on Apple, Spotify, or anywhere else you listen.
You can also listen live each morning starting at 5 a.m. Wall Street time on Bloomberg 1130 in New York, Bloomberg 99.1 in Washington, Bloomberg 92.9 in Boston, and nationwide on Sirius XM Channel 121.
Plus, listen coast to coast on the Bloomberg Business app, now with Apple CarPlay and Android Auto interfaces.
And don't forget to subscribe to Bloomberg News Now. It's the latest news whenever you want it, in 5 minutes or less. Search Bloomberg News Now on your favorite podcast platform to stay informed all day long. I'm Karen Moscow.
And I'm Nathan Hager. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day right here on Bloomberg Daybreak.